This is a special edition of World News Tonight with David Muir, reporting tonight from Cuba.
Good evening tonight from Havana, where we witnessed an historic moment today. President Obama standing side by side with Cuban President Raul Castro, saying the United States and Cuba are no longer enemies, a thaw decades after the Cold War ended. But there were tense moments here today. The two leaders did not always see eye to eye. There was the handshake between the American president and the president of Cuba, and then a private meeting between the two. And this evening, as we're on the air in the West, the first images from the state dinner here in Cuba. But there was also that rare and true sign of the shift here, a news conference. Raul Castro taking questions along with President Obama. And Castro did not hide his criticism of the United States. And in another unexpected moment at the end of the news conference, Raul Castro reaches for President Obama's arm there. It made for an awkward moment with much of the world watching. A short time after arriving here in Cuba, our exclusive walk with President Obama through Old Havana. And tonight, right here, our new interview with him. We sat down with him just a short time ago after his meeting with Raul Castro. And we begin tonight with what it was like in that room. You have said that you would speak candidly with President Castro about the serious differences you have with the Cuban government, particularly on human rights and on democracy. So take us inside that room today. What did you tell President Castro that needs to change here in Cuba?
Well, what I indicated to him was that for 50 years they have used American aggression or interest in regime change as the excuse for why they had to guard against dissent inside of Cuba. And as normalization occurs, that excuse is taken away. And what I indicated to him is that we can't force changes on Cuba, but what we can do and will continue to do is to stand up for the rights that we consider to be universal.
You heard President Castro late today. He said, give me a list of political prisoners and I'll release them. Yeah. Will you give him a list?
Well, the truth of the matter is we've given him lists in the past, and they have responded intermittently to our engagement.
You were in that room. Do you trust President Castro? Do you believe that he truly wants change here?
I believe that President Castro truly wants change. I do not believe that President Castro wants to upend the ruling party or the system that they have.
President Castro seemed to be defending himself, his record on human rights today, and he went further saying, I find it inconceivable that a government does not find a right to secure health care, food provision, and equal pay. Yeah. What did you make of that?
Well, look, this is an argument that I think the Cubans make whenever they hear criticism for the United States. Their argument is that okay, we may be, in your view, short on some democratic practices. On the other hand, you guys still engage in the death penalty or racial discrimination, and they'll tick off a list.
But when he says health care, does he have a point?
Well, here's the point, that we should not use our shortcomings as a way of deflecting the kinds of repression that happens here.
The two making history standing side by side. Raul Castro taking questions and taking hold of President Obama's arm unexpectedly.
If you think about today's press conference, as far as I can tell, that may be the first time that Raul Castro's ever stood in front of not just U.S. press, but also Cuban press and answered questions. And that could not have happened unless we had changed this policy.
You plan to meet with dissidents here. Yeah. Did you choose the list?
Absolutely.
Did Cuba have a hand in it?
No. We were very clear that we're going to meet with who it is that we want to meet.
You're aware of some of the numbers, Mr. President. By some estimates, 1,400 people arrested in January alone, setting a new high. 500 of them women. In fact, the arrests are higher since you announced normalizing relations with Cuba. Even arrests as you were arriving here in Havana. Does that concern you?
Well, it does concern me, and my view is that people have a right to express their differences. Now, one of the things I said to President Castro, and I truly believe in this, is that if they were less fearful of dissent, that not only might they be able to improve governance here, but I suspect that they could enhance their legitimacy in the eyes of the Cuban people.
Will you meet with Fidel Castro?
You know, if his health was good enough that I could meet with him, I'd be happy to meet with him, just as a symbol of the end of, or the closing of this Cold War chapter in our mutual histories. It's not clear to me what the state of his health is.
So it could happen?
I have no idea.
So many Americans back home are asking us, which is, what's the bottom line here on tourism in Cuba? A lot of families want to come visit, not solely as a one-to-one exchange, but to drink a mojito, smoke a cigar, go to the beach. When do you see that happening?
Well, I think it's going to be happening very soon. The administrative changes that we made allow individuals now to come here for educational purposes. We now have an agreement where cruise lines can travel from the United States directly to Havana. We have now direct U.S. flights to Cuba, which will make it much easier to travel. But inevitably it's going to happen, and when you think about the proximity, it took me no longer to get to Havana than it does for me to get to Miami from Washington, D.C.
Calvin Coolidge took a battleship to get here.
It took a lot longer.
Back home, it is spring break season. A lot of children are home with their parents, and we've all noticed that you brought the first daughters with you.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you have told them about the history that they're witnessing, because their generation will not see Cuba in the same way the rest of us do.
No, it's really interesting. Last night at dinner, we talked about why it is that Cuba occupied such a special place in the imagination of America, and trying to describe for them the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we came to a nuclear catastrophe.
So that's your lesson for them. We saw the image of Malia helping you with Spanish, though, in Old Havana.
You know, her Spanish is much better than mine, and I'm hoping that she has a chance to get entirely fluent. One of my big regrets that I was too much of a goof-off when I was in school to really perfect my Spanish.
The president and his daughter doing the translating in Old Havana. But back to that tense moment here today, two leaders forging a new partnership, but clearly not agreeing on everything. President Castro denying that Cuba holds political prisoners, and as you heard him say, he said, "Give me a list." These images showing the government here still tightly controlling dissent, protesters arrested just as President Obama was arriving here in Cuba last night. Tomorrow, the president meets with dissidents, the president telling me he chose them, not Castro. And ABC's Jonathan Karl met with some of those dissidents who will be in the room, who will get their moment with President Obama. John with us in Cuba tonight. And John, you heard Castro say, give me the list, I'll release them.
And David, they told me today that the human rights situation here in Cuba has actually gotten worse over the past year.
John Karl with me here in Cuba. John, thank you. And much more from Cuba later in the broadcast, including when will Americans be able to come here simply as tourists, not as part of an exchange, and the American hotels tonight already announcing their new plans. When we come back here tonight from Cuba, the streets of Havana are alive, the gold rush is on, opportunity knocks.
ABC World News Tonight with David Muir.
Finally tonight from here in Havana, we have returned to find the old American vintage cars that drive through the streets of this city. But opportunity knocks. Here's ABC's Jim Avila.
The internet has come to Havana. It's as slow as the cars, but it's here. Jim Avila, ABC News, Havana.
Jim Avila tonight. Jim, thank you. And thank you for watching here on a Monday night. I'm David Muir from all of us here at ABC News. Thanks for watching. Good night.